Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have a couple passed. Um, Thank you for joining us. Really excited to continue our webinar series. And before I turn it over to Kelly Sinicola, wanted to talk about a couple of housekeeping items and reminders first. If you do have a question during the presentation, please feel free to add that in the chat box. There is a chat icon at the bottom of the screen for those unfamiliar with Zoom. Which I think is few people now in this world we live in. So you can click that and add a question at any time. If we're unable to get to it in that moment, we will certainly circle back towards the end of the presentation and make sure that either we answer in moment or certainly follow up afterwards if we need to. We would ask that everyone remain on mute with their microphone. Just to make sure that we can keep down the background noise while the presentation is going. Lastly, we will be recording as well as sending out this presentation for your use. So you will have that for reference. Feel free to take notes, but wanted you to be aware that you certainly will have the dialogue as well as the slide presentation after that. Okay, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Kelly Sinicola.
Hey, everybody. I'm happy to see lots of familiar names, if not familiar faces for everybody. Today, we're continuing our webinar series that we've been doing for the majority of this weird COVID season that we're going through right now. So we're going to start today off with a poll with what ERP do you use? So are you on a Banner system, Colleague, Genzabar, PeopleSoft, or other? If you do use something that's not listed, please feel free to let us know what you use in the chat.
Okay, I'll give a couple more seconds for folks to answer. Looks like we are heavy Colleague this afternoon.
Again. Oh, and PowerPage too. Good.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so 80% Colleague, 13% Banner, and 7% Other. So today we're going to be going over some regulatory changes that are affecting financial aid currently, and then also some Colleague and Banner specifics on things that you should look for on those screens. So it's applicable for everybody. So today we wanted to cover preparing for the upcoming financial aid cycles for the 2020 to 2021 and 2021 to 2022 cycles. Thank you, 2020, for making it so difficult to spit out financial aid years. Today I was preparing to talk about, how to make your award years slicker and cooler and leaner and more. Can you hear me now? And we changed, after I started reading about all of the regulations, I wanted to make sure that everybody knew how to accommodate those regulations in the financial aid cycles. And that's what everybody should be focused on right now. So why? Well, first of all, preparing for the next aid year can start right now. If you're a Colleague user, you may have noticed on the Ellucian Hub in the communities area that Michelle Taylor has already released the new financial aid year spreadsheet, so you can start running FASA to start setting up that new aid year. If you're a Banner system, you know that if you loaded the release from June, a skeleton year was created already for the next aid cycle, and then you still have to create it on your system, but that skeleton year was created. What we do know, too, is there are still many unknowns, unfortunately. And so we're going to be talking about some of the items I discussed in my last webinar on financial aid implications and some things that are still holding true for as we enter the fall season. So in the news, the HEROES Act was passed by the House in May, but it's currently still stagnant in the Senate. Right now the Senate is on their Independence Day break, which is a 2-week break in between the 4th of July and July 20th. So we can anticipate that nothing is going to move on that bill until at least after July 20th. What that act does provide for, it's a second phase, possibly, of the CARES Act, where $90 billion is earmarked for a state fiscal stabilization fund, where 30% of that must go to higher education public institutions. $10 billion would go directly to institutions. $1.7 billion is earmarked specifically for minority-serving institutions. $7 billion is for private nonprofit institutions, and $1.4 billion is for public and nonprofit institutions with unmet need. And again, that HEROES Act is an idea for a second phase of the stimulus, but it still sits in the House, not yet approved. We have received additional department guidance since the last webinar, which was in May. As I tell everybody that I'm on a call with now, I can't believe it's July, I just call every month March. So I think I need to move past that. But the CARES Act timeframe was extended from March 13th, 2020 to December 31st, 2020, or until the last date that the national emergency is in effect. There was some discussion last month of potentially ending the national emergency phase, but that stopped as cases started fluctuating again throughout the different states. So we still don't know when the last date of the national emergency will be. Now that we have more guidance now where the accrediting agency virtual evaluation visits, if you are waiting or pending an accrediting agency visit, we are allowed now to have one virtual evaluation, but then that must be followed by a focused on-site visit when travel allows, and as timely as it can be when travel is allowed to that site. What we were also given was broad approval for distance education. There used to be a requirement where an agency had to approve a distance education program where that agency had in its scope of approval at least 50% distance education. Now, instead, that requirement has been waived, and distance education programs can be allowed by accrediting agencies where they don't meet that 50% requirement. Now, if under the financial statement and compliance audit requirements, those have been now extended by 6 months, so you have extra time to complete your financial statements and compliance audits. If you're an institution that is going through a change of ownership, right now your window has been extended by 6 months as well, giving people a little extra time to get their paperwork together. As you may know, MCAT testing has stopped during this time, so the MCAT requirements have been waived for foreign graduate medical school admissions. And then those will be made required again once testing is able to start up. We do have a requirement for verification of high school completion status. Generally, that means that we receive an official marked transcript from a secondary institution. Now, during this time, if you're unable or if the applicant is unable to get an official transcript from their high school, an institution may instead accept a signed and dated statement from the applicant attesting to the completion of that secondary program. So that's something different. Now, when the transcripts and everything starts opening up again and you are able to receive a transcript, you do have to update the student record with that official transcript and indicate that you now have both on file. So we're going on the honor system. Now, some updates that have happened because of the CARES Act. If you're a school, an institution that has received loans from the SBA through the Paycheck Protection Program, under that program, you're eligible for possible payroll forgiveness. And that means the loan that you took out to cover those payroll and paycheck expenses can be waived and forgiven. So the department will now take into account an estimate of the loan of the amount of forgiveness. So it's going to look at the total amount of the loan and look at what's forecasted to be forgiven. Or if you've already had that loan amount forgiven and it's on your institution's audited financial statements and it can be attested to by the institution's auditor, the department, when calculating your composite score, will now exclude the loan from the total liabilities and increase the institution's equity or net assets when calculating that composite score. So that's something to keep in mind as we enter into this new cycle. Now, as I covered in the new financial aid implications webinar that you can see still recorded on our website, there has been continued impact on return to Title IV. Now, under the CARES Act, It does not provide a blanket waiver of return to Title IV requirements, neither does the department allow guidance that allows you to provide a blanket waiver. Instead, all of the return to Title IV calculations must be completed for any and all withdrawn students during this time. Now, the calculation has to be performed, but what it does do is waive the requirements for schools to return unearned Title IV grant and loan assistance as a result of that calculation. So you still have to perform the calculation if you're on colleague, for example, on ROFC, but then instead of sending that money back, the institution gets to retain it. This does include all direct loans. Now, what it also does, we have new guidance on this, is it waives student grant overpayments that result from the return to Title IV process for students who withdraw as a result of COVID-19. So in this case, if the grant overpayment occurs, the institution is not required to notify the student. It's also not required to notify the NSLDS of the grant overpayment. You, however, cannot apply any Title IV credit balance to pay down the grant overpayment. You also have to document this in the student's file when the waiver is applied. So, for example, on colleague, you could put a note in FASE to document that a grant overpayment waiver has been applied to the student's account. Now, an important caveat on this as well, if the funds have already been returned for the grant overpayment, you must re-request those to sort of undo that mistake that was made. Now, there's also some reporting requirements as part of all of these changes to return to Title IV. And you have to maintain identifying information for each student for whom the return to Title IV was waived. So this means the student's last name, first name, a student ID number, some identifying information to indicate what student had that waiver. You also have to keep track of the payment period begin and ending dates, the amount of the Title IV grant or the loan that each student received, and the total amount of the Title IV grant or loan that the institution has not returned as a result of that return to Title IV calculation. Now, one thing to note, you have to identify all of this information, you have to maintain all of this information, but currently the department doesn't have a way of receiving this information. So they're working on a process to receive this report from institutions, but it's not currently developed. So they are looking for patience in this matter, and just make sure that everybody here is doing their due diligence to collect all this information, so when that reporting process is available, you'll all be ready to submit that data. Now, we've also heard more guidance on what does a withdrawal mean under COVID-19 circumstances. So, if you're an institution that had to move from a ground-based instruction program to distance learning, then that is qualified as a COVID-19 circumstance for a withdrawal. Also, if you've had to close campus housing or other campus facilities, or if you've experienced other disruptions in instruction, which is sort of a broad category, then any withdrawals during that time can be considered as a result of COVID-19 circumstances and would fall into these Title IV calculations, maintaining those funds, and also other things further in the presentation. Now, if your institution didn't fall into those three situations, the student can also withdraw based on COVID-19 circumstances if they or a family member had an illness, so they were sick with COVID-19, if they need to become a caregiver to someone that was ill, or maybe they lost child care, or if they're a first responder, or even if the student has an inability to access the Wi-Fi that's required for them to partake in that instruction, then they could have a withdrawal for COVID-19 related reasons. And there was a question in chat. At this point, all of the requirements are intact through at least December 2020. And that is correct unless the state of national emergency is ended before December 31st, 2020. In that case, that new date would be what all of these things fall under. And so that means we do have an extension through this coming fall semester, so into this 2020 to 2021 award year. There's also been an impact to satisfactory academic progress. As I talked about in the last webinar, there's been a change to the way SAP is calculated. You can exclude now any attempted credits that were not completed as a result of a qualifying emergency, so any of those things that were stated on the previous slide, from the quantitative component without an SAP appeal. You must have reasonably determined that the student's failure to complete those credits were the result of a COVID-19 related circumstance. So again, a campus closure, campus housing being closed, disruption of instruction, or if the institution temporarily ceases operations. Now, one caveat to this, the pace of the program must still ensure completion within the maximum time frame. So that rule of SAP has not been waived during this time. There's also been impacts to federal work study and FSEOG. Schools are not required to provide an institutional share for any work study or FSEOG awards made for 1920 or the upcoming 2020 to 21 award year. It's still not waived, and this is the same in back in May, not waived for third-party private for-profit organizations that employ federal work-study students in off-campus agreements. You can make emergency FSEOG awards for the 2020 to 21 award year if the qualifying emergency continues into the award year. So as long as the national emergency isn't ended before the December 31 cutoff, like it's set to right now, then you can continue to make those emergency FSEOG awards like we had to do back in spring. Keep in mind that the national emergency began on March 1st, 2020, so it's applicable to anything following the declaration of a national emergency on March 13th. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. You cannot use 1920 allocations for 2021 awards, but the rule is still in place that you can carry forward up to 10% of your initial and supplemental FSEOG allocations from 1920. So you do have the option of taking at least, at most 10% of those initial and supplemental allocations and move them forward from the 1920 to the 2020-2021 award year. You're also allowed to transfer up to 100% of the unexpended federal work study allocations to FSEOG, so that's still in effect with the new extension. And institutions are allowed to use any portion of FSEOG for emergency FA grants. But the department is, in their guidance, offering the caution that if this emergency doesn't continue to stretch on and you run out of FSEOG money, then you're out of FSEOG money. So you want to be mindful of that as you're awarding these emergency grants. Now we do have an update from the last webinar. At that point in time, we weren't sure how these CARES Act funds were going to be treated for tax purposes for the students that were receiving them. There's now new guidance that they are not considered gross income. However, they will appear on the 1098-T, so we can expect a software update to that in December and possibly January if it's anything like this year. So all grant aid processed and administered by the institution appears in box 5, and that is where we're going to see these CARES Act funds. It cannot appear in box 1. Box 1 is indicated for funds that have gone to tuition-related expenses. Even if a student received those CARES Act funds and maybe bought a Chromebook so they could take part in online education, that's not considered box 1 eligible. So something to note. Also something to think about as you look at how your institution individually processed CARES Act funds to make sure they were treated as a grant. There was the 3 options provided, either on Banner or on Colleague for, how to process those funds. So, it's a good time to take a look at that now and see how you're going to fare for the 1098-T season. We've had a fund past 3 years, so, why should this one be any different? In case you missed it, the 2021 Pell schedule came out. The maximum scheduled award is $6,345, which is a $150 increase. The max Pell eligible expected family contribution is $5,711. You can see more information on that in the Dear Colleague letter, which is available on the IFAP site. The software update was released. Most institutions had already updated the PEF screen in Colleague or the screens in Banner to update those awards, but just in case you missed it, look out for those Dear Colleague letters. Then, just to add to 2020 fun, the National Center for Education Studies publishes SIP codes every 10 years. And 2020 is one of those years. So the last time those were released was 2010. And now these codes must be used in any COD processing beginning with the 2020-2021 award year. There were 47 new SIP codes, 12 deleted SIP codes, 149 consolidated SIP codes, and 1,994 SIP codes with no change. And then new for 2021, the program SIP code publication years are now required. So the publication year has been a field on the schema for a while, but it wasn't a required piece of that schema. Now in this award year, it is required, so that information does need to be filled out. For some colleague specifics, there were software updates released to accommodate this SIP code change. It did have a required DMI update. That DMI update was required to update the schema for the COD processing. The software update included the new mnemonic CIPC, which is the SIP code conversion utility, which converted codes from the 2010 versions to the 2020 versions. Now, where clients struggled with that is if you're still processing 1920 awards and 2021 awards at the same time, any 1920 awards that were sent with the new SIP codes would have been rejected by COD, and 2021 would have been sent successfully. There was a new software update that was added to this bundle to accommodate that change and keep a spot for the old 1920 code to exist so that 1920 awards could be processed and 2021 awards could also be processed. So something to keep in mind, if you haven't updated to that most recent software update, you might have problems with your exports. Ellucian also released an override field that appears on the PLCI, the DLCI, and the TGCI screens in Colleague. There's a spot for an override SIP code, which forces a send or a resend depending on what status the file is in to the COD. One thing to note about that new field is it doesn't validate against the SIP code table. So you just want to make sure you're coming in with the right SIP code so it's not sending over something incorrect to the COD. Now, on June 11th, there was another release, 021366, that corrected the SITX process, which interacts with the National Student Clearinghouse. The SIP code right now has been, the SIP code year field has been hard-coded to 2020, so any subsequent SITX runs will pass in 2020 for your clearinghouse reporting, and that's a hard-coded value. Now, the Banner side had software updates as well. Now, RPP-SPGM will auto-populate 2020 with SIP code information if the age year is 2021 or greater. If you go into the RPA-SSUI screen and manually enter a SIP code, it'll auto-populate the year 2020 as well. RPP-SPGM and RPA-SSUI will continue to work for 1920 records, so that logic has already been built into both of those processes. Of course, you want to coordinate with the registrar's office for planning any changes to SIP codes, and those are stored on the STV-CIPC screen where you can enter the SIP codes, and then the major is associated with the SIP code on STV-MAJR. If you have any crosswalk codes, so if the code is changing from 2010 to 2020, all of those crosswalk codes can be defined on RPI-CIPC. And then those would default into RPP-SPGM or RPA-SSUI. Now, something also that's new for the 2020-21 award year, but not yet required, is annual student loan acknowledgement. So borrowers have the option this year to complete the student loan acknowledgement process. It will be required next year in 2021-2022. That requirement has been waived for this year. It is a change in the master promissory note confirmation process, and it must be completed before a borrower can receive the first disbursement of the first loan for an award year starting in the 21-22 award year. The borrowers must view and acknowledge how much they currently owe in federal student loans as part of this process. So what you should know and do right now. It's a good time to update your websites and any written materials to include information about the annual student loan acknowledgement. It's a good area to update the paragraph if you already have something that's referring to entrance counseling or credit counseling. You can add in this component as well. You also want to update your internal processes to ensure that borrowers complete the acknowledgement so that you aren't dispersing funds without that acknowledgement in place. This does not replace the current requirements for entrance counseling, credit counseling, or master promissory note completion. All of that is still required. This is just an add-on. As for borrower impact, this should take less than 10 minutes to complete. It's designed to be quick. First-time borrowers will answer questions regarding their state, the school they're attending, their expected degree, and their field of study. You will then see summary information from the college scorecard. And the next step is viewing general financial literacy information. And then they have to check a box acknowledging that they read and understood the information that was presented to them. Now, if they're a returning aid recipient and already have loans outstanding, they're going to view summary information from the NSLDS that includes their current outstanding balance. Now, when I was researching this, part of me thought back to 19-year-old Kelly looking at my student loans. I had some significant student loans, and that outstanding balance number may have been a little scary to 19-year-old Kelly. But it's also going to show an estimated 10-year standard monthly payment based on the borrower's current balance. So it's going to calculate that and show it to the borrower. It will also display the servicer information, the loan limit information, so how much that borrower can borrow, grant summary and limits, and then that borrower has to check a box acknowledging that they read and understood in order to move forward with the process. So there is some student information system impact. A rule must be created that confirms that the informed borrowing is complete before it disperses any loans. So this is going to be similar to any master promissory note or entrance counseling checks that you currently have on your system. There's 3 new tags in the response block: informed borrowing complete, informed borrowing completion date, as well as informed borrowing ID. So for some colleague system specifics, this was released on April 23rd, 2020 as part of the COD release. That software update does have a associated required DMI release that updated to the, made updates to the COD schema. Keep in mind it's not a requirement until next year, but the schema has been updated to reflect these changes. Colleague also delivered 2 new computed columns to identify borrowers that have not completed the acknowledgement requirement. There's one on the SA Accure file, SA Stu AC Loan Flag, and one on the TA Accure file, TA Stu AC Loan Flag. So either of those could be used in your disbursement rules to make sure that no one's getting that disbursement before completing that acknowledgement. There's also been updates made to Banner to accommodate this change. The RERAM 21 process will load into the RLR-DIBT, the Informed Borrower Tool table. You will see some places refer to it as the Informed Borrower Tool, some places will refer to it as Annual Student Loan Acknowledgement. There has been some tweaks and changes to the names as the DOE has been figuring out this process. Now, it's going to populate Banner only when the information is marked complete. If it has not been marked complete, it's going to leave that information null on the Banner table. You'll be able to view this on the RLA DLOR screen on the ASLA tab. So it has a new tab for Annual Student Loan Acknowledgement. And keep in mind, that Annual Student Loan Acknowledgement, again, is not required until next year, but all of those schema changes exist right now, so you could start testing out that process to make sure it's ready for next year. So what is new in the 21-22 year? Well, a little bit of good news. As we would expect, the years have all been incremented by 1, so that's a good thing. Comment codes contain no significant changes this year, which is also good. So if you're a colleague school that uses the missing letter that reference those comment codes in your communication management setup, you shouldn't have a lot of updates in those paragraphs themselves this year. If you are a school that prints the ISER, which isn't a requirement, there are 2 new flags that will appear on that printout under the IRS Data Field Flags section to indicate if the student or the parent filed Schedule 1. So again, printing ISERs is not a requirement, but if you are a school that prints ISERs, you will see those 2 new fields there. So something to consider as everybody's going into the fall, if you are a school that is considering any semester date changes or any tweaks to you'll want to take a look at your budget components to make sure that they're still accurate, just in case you have to re-award those students. So you're going to want to look at your budget components for residency expenses, any commuting expenses, etc. And we do have tools to help you through that semester date change process. So if you are handling it manually, just give us a call. We can help you out, make it a little more smoother. Okay, so in case you missed it during these crazy times, you may have missed, we don't call award letters anymore. Those are now offer letters. And there is a configurable HTML and PDF offer letter available in Colleague. That's available on the OLPS screen for setting up those parameters and OLTR. There's also been updates made for that's a flag for the fallen soldier requirement. There's also been updates made this year to the FASA screen to improve on the pattern matching that's available. So FASA is used for creating your new award year, and now there's been improvements made to pattern matching, so your communication management codes that get copied from year to year to year, you can have some more sophisticated patterns now for that process. There's also a new mnemonic. I always like to call those out just in case you need an update to your colleague security. It's called IUCR, and it's a new process used to identify any unsent correction records. So make sure you check out Colleague UI and make sure you have access to that one. There's also been new document attachment functionality that was released in Self-Service 2.27. And there are further updates coming to update the FA Self-Service checklist. So with these updates, students can now log into Self-Service and upload documents directly in Self-Service. So the idea there is they could use them for verification purposes, sending in any documents to you directly that maybe you would have had to otherwise have the student go to campus for. Now on the banner side, there's updates to R&R GL21 to allow reset global options and to copy FM to IM. There's also been a number of college financing plan updates. So new fields have been added to that process, and you also now have the option to add a logo to the college finance plan that appears on the web. There's also, I wanted to point out, new updates coming in just 3 days, July 13th, 2020. There will be a new release to impact the COD extract processes to resolve issues with RER EX19 and RER EX20. So make sure that IT knows that those are coming and that you're prepared. Now, there's always a number of resources to check out. The IFAP website has updated CARES Act guidance. There's more information on the annual student loan acknowledgement process on the IFAP site as well. And just again, that's not a requirement this year, but will be a requirement next year. I've mentioned this every webinar, I think. The Ellucian Hub has a community set up for COVID-19. So other schools, other clients are talking in that community about how things are changing on campus because of COVID-19. So it's a good time to chime in and interact with the community there. The Department of Education also has a specific area of their site dedicated to coronavirus. And then if you need more information about the SIP code changes, the NCES has information about the 2020 changes, It also has a nice feature on the website where you can look up a 2010 code and translate it to a 2020 code just to see what your impact is. Also, those EDE updates were released at the end of June, and so there's an update to the electronic guide. And as I mentioned, very limited updates so far, so knocking on wood, throwing salt over my shoulder, everything good luck I can do, good mojo, to say that hopefully it'll be a smooth sailing FA setup without jinxing us too much. So I'm going to open it up for questions.
Sorry, I think we did have one question that was in there, Kelly, that was looking for, at this point, all these requirements are intact through at least 2020, December of 2020, is that correct? If these circumstances do not apply, do funds then have to be returned?
Right.
We thought the reason did not matter, so.
Yep, so right now the extensions are in place until December 31st, 2020 if the national emergency isn't ended. If the national state of emergency is ended, then that will be the new date that these updates and provisions end. If these circumstances do not apply, do funds then have to be returned? If you want to come off mute and
provide a little bit more context.
And then can you repeat the mnemonics and converting zip codes? I'm just going to, everybody close your eyes. I don't want anybody to get dizzy. I'm going to go back to that slide.
Are you able to come off while we scroll back? Or I guess if you want to go to the mnemonics and then we can circle back on that because they had an additional question about the emergency SDOG. So.
Yeah, so that's the CIPC mnemonic, Joan, and that was released with that software update. So if that doesn't come up for you, then you're going to want to first check your colleague security access and make sure you have access to that new mnemonic because that would have to be updated by IT. And then if it's not in there still, then you want to make sure that IT loaded that software update. If a student has a 2020-2021 FAFSA on file, are they eligible for CARES Act funds? Right, so having a FAFSA is one of the first levels of eligibility for CARES Act funds. I believe the extension was made still through December 31st, Joan, but I'll take another look at that just in case.
Okay. Before we move on to the next question, they said their mic is not working. I will put, they were sharing privately, so let me copy this and post to everyone, Kelly, so you can read it because I don't want to get it wrong.
And yes, Joan, it's always just in case right now. That's the world we're living in.
Okay, and Kelly, I just posted in there for R2T4. It was our understanding that no return funds were required. Are we understanding the person only replies to withdrawal reason is COVID related?
That was the new guidance that was issued after all of these first guidances were made regarding return to Title IV, that now the withdrawal has to be a COVID-related reason. Now, again, those reasons are quite broad, so if your institution was a grounds-based instruction and went online, that counts. If you had to close any campus facilities, that counts. If you had any disruption in instruction, which is sort of vague, or then the student reasons, if the student couldn't access Wi-Fi or had something preventing them from accessing instruction, if they had loss of child care, if they became ill themselves or had a family member ill due to COVID reasons.
All right, and Please put in chat if there is any other additional insight. Okay, they said thank you. Perfect. Mindy is asking, will you show the slide with the rules for the colleague specifics under DMI? There are 2 rules that they'd like to copy, and you will get a copy of this, Mindy, when we send out the recording. So know that you can reference back to that as well.
Yeah, but I will just say, Mindy, that these are 2 computed columns that you could then use in rules, as long as you have access to the SA Accurate file or the TA Accurate file. And SA is student ID driven, and TA is a concatenated key. You're welcome.
Okay. Oh, the next question was about the our emergency SEOG funds to be reported in box 1.
You know, that is a good question. I haven't seen, the CARES Act funds were called out as of course being box 5 and not box 1 on the 1098T. I haven't seen any guidance yet on the FSEOG funds, but I can definitely follow up.
Okay, and we will follow up directly and see if we get that answer. That would be great.
As the season shapes up for us.
Okay. Any additional questions? Feel free to put them in chat, or at this point, now that we've completed the piece, you can take yourself off of mute. That would be great. And ask if you have anything. Okay. If there are no questions, or if you want to hang around and ask a question one-on-one, we'll hang out for a little bit as we've got some about 15 minutes additional, but we always would like for folks to join us as we continue our Webinar series. You can always find out what's next or what's upcoming by going to Forelli.com, what's new. Additionally, next week, I can give you a preview. We are going to be talking about our core system administrative services, and that will be a simulcast with those of you who are registered for Ellucian Live. We will be doing that with our office hours. So more to come on that. We'll be sending that out, and Ellucian will be sharing that information as well. Hope we see you then. Like I said, anyone who has additional questions, please feel free to hang on and we can talk one-on-one. Oh. Quick one, if you don't mind. Go ahead, Joan.
Okay. Oh, quick one-on-one.
Oh, okay. Well, then yeah. Thank you, Joan. We will chat then. Thank you, everyone.
Today. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.